In the wake of the disastrous Outer Reaches Rebellion, the Terran Alliance's Liberal Party rose to become the dominant power at Geneva for the first time since their inception. The rival expansionists could have retained their existing seats until 2240, but their defeat was so absolute that they were functionally ousted from power. Most party heads stepped down. The Alliance Global Militia's inability to restore order saw humanity's distant colonies gain their de facto independence. While the Liberals had opposed military intervention against the rebel worlds, they were certainly no friends to the secessionists. In many ways, their beliefs were even more extreme than their peers who had led them into war. There was a lot of injured pride on Earth in the aftermath of such an embarrassing failure. Nobody wanted to acknowledge what had taken place out on the fringes of settled space. Perhaps for this reason, the Liberals instituted a series of oppressive laws that they hoped would put the matter to bed. Under their watch, all future off-world travel was suspended. Furthermore, any discussion of the Outer Reaches Rebellion was made illegal. Those who spoke out against these authoritarian laws found their assets seized and their bank accounts emptied. Such blatant financial manipulation caused the value of the credits to plummet. Until this point, the average Terran had been little affected by the distant unrest. Not so anymore. The Liberal Party's most infamous act came in 2242 when they issued the Demarcation Declaration. Effective immediately, the Terran Alliance relinquished control of all systems beyond a single jump from Earth. Henceforth, the colonies would have to fend for themselves. Naturally, this move was disastrous for the least developed worlds who were still dependent on aid shipments to survive. Many had been unhappy with Terran rule, but the Demarcation Declaration was tantamount to a death sentence for tens of thousands of colonists. This extreme action brought just as much chaos to humanity's homeworld. Nations were cut off from their extrasolar holdings, furthering the economic collapse. Rich and poor were affected equally. Wealthier states may have had a stronger domestic economy, but those industries were more reliant on an uninterrupted flow of resources arriving back on Earth. Many were simply outraged that the people they still perceived as their countrymen had been readily abandoned. As word filtered back that entire colonies had starved to death, rioting broke out across the planet. In short order, the Liberals themselves would become victims of their own mismanagement, losing their majority in Parliament that same year. The Expansionist Party was left to pick up the pieces, but there was no reversing the Demarcation Declaration. For the first time in its history, the Terran Alliance had a definitive border in space. A mere 20 systems still remained loyal to their roots, those core worlds being just 22 light-years away on average. Now that the Expansionists were back in power, they sought to silence their detractors. Controls were imposed on those professions that most often criticized the government, limiting how much they could work and what was deemed acceptable conduct. Black uniformed artist administrators would pay a visit to anyone who persisted in their behavior. Over time, the definition of artist expanded to include other occupations such as lawyers and physicians, any line of work that claimed to foster so-called freethinkers. In 2247, the Expansionist Party changed tack. Throughout the first century of jump travel, the Terran Alliance had attempted to limit how many of its perceived enemies were heading out into space. Now, Parliament adopted the opposite approach. They encouraged those undesirables to leave, perhaps hoping that it would secure their grasp on the reins of power. This change in policy began the Second Exodus. A significant brain drain ensued as humanity's best and brightest departed for regions of space where they were no longer oppressed, leading to a stagnation of technology both on Earth, where they lacked the freedom to pursue such ventures, and in the colonies, where a person's time was most often consumed with just trying to stay alive. When the Liberals came to power again in 2252, they went from encouraging their political rivals to emigrate off-world, to actively assisting in finding them a berth aboard an outbound transport. Revisiting our star analogy from earlier in this history, this was akin to a supernova that follows stellar collapse. Over the course of the Second Exodus, millions of Terrans would end up leaving their home, heading for a new life amongst the stars. The second half of the 23rd century saw the balance of power seesaw back and forth between the expansionists and the liberals, with neither side able to secure a majority for more than 2 years. Such pointless bickering served only to increase political apathy among the population, who did not feel in any way represented by Parliament. Voting in local elections made no difference, as the heads of state either didn't care or were powerless to oppose the almighty Alliance world government. Of the various institutions that had been tarnished by the failures of the Outer Reaches Rebellion, perhaps none had come off worse than the Alliance Global Militia. It had been largely neglected since the end of that conflict, neither party wishing to associate with the disgraced officers. At the same time, both sides feared the other taking control and staging a coup, so they continued to be generous when allocating funds, some would say bribes, to the AGM. Political factions did infiltrate the military, with a handful of units swearing personal loyalty to one party or the other. Around this time, an Alliance Navy officer, James McKenna, was making his way up through the ranks. Despite his aptitude, his rebellious nature stymied advancement during his youth, but by 2295, he achieved the rank of Fleet Admiral and was given overall command of the Navy. Up till then, this branch served as little more than a glorified taxi service for the colonial marines, but James had grand ambitions for it. McKenna was something of a visionary. He secretly harbored aspirations to restore Terran control over the colonies. Rather than line his own pockets with a constant stream of money flowing in from Geneva, he used it to reinvigorate his tired personnel and beat them back into a competent fighting force. The centerpiece of his reforms was to be a new class of weapon. Advancements in Kearney Fushida drives allowed for new compact cores that would free up tonnage to mount more powerful thrusters, thicker armor, and larger caliber cannons than anything that had come before. 400 years earlier, a similar revolution in design among blue water navies had birthed HMS Dreadnought, a vessel so awesome that it rendered every other design in service obsolete. Inspired by this story, James adorned his pet project with the same name. Since the completion of Project Aphrodite, the industry that had sprung up around Titan had wasted away. Seeking a new source of revenue, they had begun converting their factories into naval production hubs. Their position just at the edge of the safe jump distance from Sol meant it was fairly safe to navigate to, bringing a vessel in close to the shipyards. With components coming from Venus, Terra, and Mars, the first true battleship began to take form. In the year 2300, TAS Dreadnought entered service. McKenna's new flagship massed an astonishing 960,000 tons, carried a crew of over 1,000, and was armed with an array of enormous naval autocannons. What's more, this was only the first of 7 such vessels the Fleet Admiral had ordered. While this activity did raise a few eyebrows, the Terran Alliance humoured James by supporting the construction of these expensive boondoggles, never believing that any other planet could field a weapon that would necessitate such overkill. McKenna was not done yet though. In 2305, Dytron Heavy Industries was commissioned to build 20 Dark-class light cruisers, adding to the growing fleet over the next decade. The Alliance world government was entirely dysfunctional by the dawn of the 24th century. Since 2296, neither party had achieved sufficient seats in Parliament to win a majority. Various coalitions with smaller fringe groups were attempted between then and 2309, but these proved impossible to maintain, with none lasting more than a year. The Terran Alliance had come to resemble more of a black hole than a shining star, with the population of Earth trapped in a decaying orbit. Tension between the two main political parties had soared in recent years. Certain elements within them had begun to stockpile weapons in anticipation of armed conflict. Shady re-education camps had become an all-too-common sight. As it happened, the first sparks of violence occurred not on Earth, but across a handful of core worlds in 2312. This soon spread to the mother planet. Over the next 3 years, tens of thousands were executed for political crimes. As people became ever more fearful to travel, the second exodus drew to a close in 2313. Over 500 new colonies had been established in under 7 decades. Mankind had by this point set foot on over 1,000 worlds. One ray of light threatened to break through the dark clouds that were forming. With the situation starting to boil over, the more moderate parliamentary representatives started to distance themselves from the established political heavyweights. The People's Independence Party surged in popularity back in 2310, shaking the populace from their malaise. With neither of the established groups close to winning a majority, it looked like the PIP would be the deciding factor in the next election. Unfortunately, the party leader, Grant Zolli, was only interested in earning money. He held off allying with either faction in the hopes that they would offer larger and larger bribes to secure his support. Zolli flip-flopped between the two, promising to form a coalition with the expansionists in August 2314, then going back on his word a month later, a decision that would soon come back to haunt him. On September 5th, he was found dead under suspicious circumstances. Robbed of their supposed champion, rioting broke out across the planet, and the Alliance Global Militia deployed to break up the disorder. The People's Independence Party further exacerbated the issue by carrying out reprisal killings. Martial law was declared in the aftermath. James McKenna, meanwhile, ordered all shore leaves cancelled and recalled his fleet back to Mars, where they began taking on stores, loading every weapon magazine to capacity. The ignition point came a few weeks later, on September 23rd. A Liberal Party splinter group had been protesting outside Parliament at Geneva. Despite calls for them to disband, they refused to do so. Fearing that their president was in danger, the expansionists called in their own loyal party troops, a move which the Liberals perceived as preparing for an attack. Gunfire broke out, plunging the capital into chaos. 1 week later, the leader of the Liberal Party's Zurich branch and his armed guards stormed the city's expansionist headquarters on September 30th, killing all within. The bitterness and hostility could no longer be contained. By year's end, the Terran Alliance civil war had spread to 6 continents. Fleet Admiral James McKenna finally intervened on June 2nd, 2315. As a demonstration of his navy's awesome destructive firepower, he ordered his ships to take up positions in orbit, then commence bombardment of Strandarroch near Scotland and another small island off the coast of Australia, erasing both from the map entirely. As the shockwaves, both literal and metaphorical, spread across the planet, McKenna began broadcasting on all channels worldwide. To the men and women of humanity's cradle, attention! This is Fleet Admiral James McKenna on board the warship Dreadnought. The destruction of the islands near Scotland and Australia was accomplished by the combined fleets of the Alliance Global Navy. I gave the order to open fire, and I am just as ready to give similar orders should anyone on Terra attempt to jam my message to its people. You have all been suffering through a bitter war. Many, mostly the innocent, have been injured or lost everything they own in the fighting. Even the fortunate few who have gone unscathed thus far must have some friend or loved one who has suffered. Terra has been a dark place these past few weeks, with little hope of getting brighter. I ask you now, what is the purpose of this suffering? Do you believe that this war is a true and honourable one that will make your lives any better? Do you honestly believe that if one side or the other wins, it will benefit you? It is my view that all of us have been duped by the lies and deceits of a few wily politicians. They have led you to believe that this war will somehow end your and the Alliance's problems once and for all. They lie. They struggle for personal power and not for your benefit. It is time for change. The government is corrupt and must go. We must bring back the voice of the people so that it may be heard. I propose the founding of a new government to replace the Alliance. A strong government responsive to its people, yet unburdened by the constant and useless elections. A strong government that will re-establish Terra as the proper center of humanity. Fellow humans, it is time that we cease to behave in the violent ways of Homo sapiens and begin to behave in the ways of Homo stellaris, men and women of the stars. Those who share this view need only lay down their weapons and return home to await further messages. Those who do not agree to change had best be warned. I intend to hunt every last one of you and feed you to the public that has been so abused. Most of the Alliance Global Militia had remained neutral during the fighting, which was largely limited to just the paramilitary forces of the expansionists and liberals. To those few units who had taken up arms in support of those corrupt politicians, McKenna gave a more terse warning. Attention all AGM members currently participating in the barbarities. Cease all hostile actions and return to your barracks, or I will bombard you into oblivion. He gave them 24 hours to stand down, after which he ordered his ships to open fire on their headquarters from orbit. For those who took shelter among the cities, he dispatched the loyal colonial marines to root them out. Both government factions attempted to fight back. On the ground, the Alliance army willingly threw their support behind McKenna, engaging the heaviest concentrations of political troops in the battles of Bangkok and Zurich. The AGM faced one of their greatest challenges in securing the ocean liner Prince Albert after government forces infiltrated the vessel. At the L4 Lagrange point, attacks against the fleet led to the Dreadnought-class TAS Wildcat and TAS Yalu colliding, causing considerable damage, but both weathered the storm. The largest battle took place at Geneva itself. The skies above the city played host to one of the largest dogfights in centuries. All three sides committed their Hurricane strike fighters to the three-way furball, with only strength in numbers winning the AGM a victory, but at heavy cost. People on the ground were just as unlucky. Most sought shelter to avoid the falling debris, but biochemical weapons were more insidious killers that claimed the lives of many thousands. With the main battles over, James set about uncovering the party leaders who had gone to ground. They had to contend with significant unrest among the populace, who had been living in fear for the past few decades, but the vast majority were firmly behind the Fleet Admiral, regardless of what form the new government he was promising them might take. He was even so kind to offer the survivors from the renegade AGM units a chance to redeem themselves, provided they accept a demotion for misconduct. Every member of the Alliance World Parliament was forced to resign. Any who declined were taken into custody. The last of the liberals were arrested in mid-July, with the final expansionist stronghold located in the Caribbean on the 22nd. When they refused to surrender, McKenna ordered their execution, bringing an end to the Terran Alliance civil war. On July 22nd, 2315, The same day the last of the fugitives were subdued, Fleet Admiral James McKenna issued a public proclamation from aboard TAS Dreadnought. He had remained in orbit throughout the conflict, looking down disapprovingly on the anarchy unfolding below. It was the first time since the AGM entered into the morass of fighting 7 weeks earlier that anyone had heard from him. His speech was to be one of the most important in history, as it would surely set the course of humanity for centuries to come. James began by lambasting the political parties for what they had turned the Terran Alliance into. What should have been a union of cooperation and equality had become an oppressive police state. The corrupt and vindictive heads of government had brought the nation to its knees in the pursuit of personal wealth and power. As McKenna saw it, the rot went too deep to save the institution. He thereby dissolved the Terran Alliance outright. For their crimes, 20 of the former party leaders were sentenced to death. The rest of the captive politicians were later released back into the public. For those individuals, prison was the best they could hope for, but mob justice often ruled. In the United States of America, the president and several senators were hanged from the roof of the White House. This anger was shared by billions across the planet. True or not, each country's leadership was perceived as going along with the authoritarian Alliance world government for personal gain at the expense of their citizens. 2315 would be the final year of not just the Terran Alliance, but of the old nation-states as well. But a dissolution of the old order was not all that McKenna promised in his speech. Having dealt with the sordid past, he turned to the future. As he saw it, Earth was perfectly positioned to become the jewel at the center of human space, a cultural and technological marvel that the struggling colonies would welcome back into their lives if only given the opportunity. Conquest was not needed to reassert Terra's influence over the outer reaches, merely the offer of trade and mutual protection. The fulfillment of this dream could not be trusted to the politicians of old. Terra needed a fair but responsive government, free of all the vices and faults of the previous administration, with a single head of state chosen but not ruled by the people. His pronouncement would later become known as the Hegemony Charter. For that day, he declared the establishment of the Terran Hegemony, a new interstellar nation that would raise mankind to greater heights than any had yet imagined. And that concludes the final chapter of the Terran Alliance, the first 330 years of BattleTech Lore and History. I really hope you have enjoyed this series, going back to the earliest days of the setting. It's been tremendous fun for me to do. I can't believe how much there was to discuss. So much more information existed about these early centuries than I realized. And it's been great to get a chance to do it justice, because I think before I had done this same time period in just an 8-minute summary. What I've discovered going back to this is that the history of the Terran Alliance is very much the death of democracy in the BattleTech setting. Now, there are still elections taking place. I think many of the planets within the Inner Sphere kind of operate locally as a democracy. But it's these first 300 years which explain why people give up on the idea of a democracy as a interstellar nation. It is still possible, of course, and some of the states that emerged after this did have that as their form of government. But of course, we've got to look at it at a meta level as well. One of the core conceits of BattleTech is kind of feudalism in space. And the history of the Terran Alliance kind of serves as the foundation of the idea of why humanity gradually shifted towards feudalism in the future. Whether that's realistic or not is a debate I'm not going to get into, but I feel if you're a BattleTech fan, you just suspend your disbelief and accept the idea of these great houses running these vast star empires. Speaking of the Great Houses, at the time the Terran Alliance draws to an end in 2315, the Inner Sphere, such as it exists at that point in time, doesn't at all resemble what's going to come later. Now, as I said at the start of this series, one of the key reasons I wanted to revisit this part of the timeline was to create a better introduction, and I feel I have done that now, and you will see these 5 chapters uploaded into a compilation in the near future. But of course, there's no denying the fact that I knew as soon as I started down this path, at the end of it I was going to be just as unhappy with the rest of the Age of War series. Now, I want to get back to the Succession Wars, and I know most of you guys do too. There will definitely come a time where I return to this era in the setting. While there's no doubt in my mind that's something I'll want to do in the future, it's just not factoring into my plans at the moment. Who knows, maybe in a year's time I'll feel differently about it, but I really want to get the Succession Wars covered. Anyway, this is becoming a very long outro for quite a short video, so let's wrap things up here. Thank you very much for watching, guys. I'm really pleased you've enjoyed this mini-series. I've loved reading all of your comments over the last month. If you enjoyed the video today, be sure to give it a like and leave me a comment again. I try to respond to as many people as I can. If you have any other friends who are interested in this sort of thing, be sure to share it with them too. And I would repeat all that advice again for the upcoming compilation video. Those ones always seem to garner more attention. I think it's just more convenient to have one complete story to share rather than a whole playlist or series of segments. Doing all of those things can support me in making these videos. If you want to be a bit more direct in your support, there is a Patreon link in the video description as well. I upload all of my videos to Patreon as soon as I'm done making them, so you can see them there ahead of the weekly premieres. Next up is going to be the 3rd chapter in the 3rd Succession War. So we're going to jump another 580 years into the future, because we're covering, I think, 2895 through to 2917. I've pretty much finished doing the rewrite for that whole series as well, so we should be good to go. Because those videos are a little bit longer in length, I think it's likely that we'll just end up doing one every 2 weeks, but I'll explain more in the video outros for those. Thank you once again for watching, guys, and I hope to see you soon for another video.